Today we're going to be ranking the studio albums of the Canadian rock band Rush. Let's get ready to rock. Welcome back to Rocker's Beer Review. Today we're going to be doing the ranking video of the Rush albums. Now Rush, Canadian power trio, formed in the 70s, have pretty much 19 studio albums that we're going to be ranking today. If you're a viewer of the channel and you watch some of the rock reviews, you'll see that we've reviewed a Rush album, Grace Under Pressure, before. But I've been meaning to do this for a long time. I wanted to rank the Rush albums. So Rush, you know, they're one of my favourite bands, but I actually got into them quite late. I'm a big fan of progressive rock, progressive metal, and basically Rush was one of those bands that sort of passed me by a little bit. I think I'd heard a bit, you know, I'd obviously heard things like Spirit the Radio that had been played before and was on certain, you know, rock compilation tapes, but I never really sort of got into them at all, and it wasn't only until sort of late 2007, 2008, something like that, that I really sort of decided that, well, you know, a lot of the bands that I was listening to were heavily influenced by Rush, so it was about time I got into them. And they've got quite a wide back catalogue. As I said, 19 studio albums, and they've released albums from the sort of early 70s right up to the sort of the 2000s, so sort of early 2000. I think the last album was 2010, 2012, something like that. So they've released quite a lot of albums, and they've got quite different phases, I suppose to say, from their sort of 70s very sort of prog rock to their sort of 80s pop prog rock, with a very 80s sound. Then they sort of go into the 90s where I think they lose their way a little bit, and then, you know, into the 2000s where, you know, the last few albums were really a sort of return to form. So without further ado, let's start with album number 19. And number 19, which I think is probably a lot of people's the lowest ranked album, and that is Presto. Now this album came out in the late 80s. It's very sort of uninspired, it's very sort of bland. You know, there was a lot of criticism about some of their 80s stuff, and there was too much keyboards and synths. But Presto just sort of, like, the songs were a bit bland, the production's really sort of sterile and just flat, and there's very little on this album that can redeem it, really. So that's my number 19, Presto. In number 18, another 80s album of Rush, a late 80s album. This is Hold Your Fire. Again, it's a bit, you know, it's a little bit bland, it's a little bit soft rock. I mean, I do like songs like Force 10 and Time Stands Still. That was obviously with Amy Mann, and it's still 80s, and it's still got synths in it, but it doesn't really have the songs of some of their sort of earlier 80s albums. So that's in 18th, Hold Your Fire. In 17th place, we're going right back to the very beginning, to their first album, just titled Rush. You know, when Rush started, they were very much seen as a sort of Canadian version of Led Zeppelin. You know, maybe a little bit of Cream in there. That's what they sounded like. They sound changed quite a lot from after their first album, and that was mainly because Neil Peart was, you know, became their drummer on their second album. This was with the original drummer. I mean, there's some great songs on there, but it's, you know, it's difficult to sort of, you know, it's very early, it's very sort of raw, and it's, as you say, Geddy Lee sings very much, he's trying to sing as much like Robert Plant, doesn't really quite come off. But Working Man is one of the key tracks on there. So that is number 17. In number 16th place, and this is where we start getting controversial now, I think Caress of Steel. You know, it's got a mix of sort of straight head rockers like Bastille Day, but then it's got some of the prog sort of epics on there, a little bit over bloated in my opinion, like Fount of the Lamnef and stuff like that. So I'm putting Caress of Steel as number 16. Number 15, Fly By Night. I mean, this is a great album. I mean, some really good songs on it. It's their second album. It's the first with Neil Peart in it, and you know, I think they've still got some of that Led Zeppelin Cream sort of sound, but they've also got, you know, full on prog. So, you know, the opener, which is Anthem, I think is a really great song, and it's a, you know, it is an anthem really. And then you've got Tour and the Snow Dog, which is a very sort of full-on prog. But, you know, for 70s, I think this is a good 70s classic Rush. But I'm still putting it in 15th, sorry. And then we've got in 14th place, then we're sort of moving back into the 90s, in Vapor Trails. Now this is a much heavier, darker album, but in my opinion, it's, you know, it's got great drumming, but it just doesn't have to quite have the songs. The production, the first, you know, the original album when it came out was a little bit muddy and a bit sort of a bit strange really, and they did remix it in 2013 and a much better, cleaner sound. But you know, in my opinion, this is them starting to come back a little bit. Obviously this was the album that was released after, you know, Neil Peart had gone through quite a lot, where he lost both his wife and his daughter within the space of a year. And I think a lot of this album is, a lot of his lyrics are very sort of hard hitting, but I don't think it really sort of, the songs really sort of do it as well for me as, you know, as a lot of their other great albums. In 13th place, I'm putting the album that actually the first album that I bought by Rush. As I said, I sort of didn't really get into Rush till the 2000s, but back in the sort of, I suppose, 98, 99, I bought Test for Echo. You know, and at the time I didn't really get into it, and still, you know, I've really listened to it recently, and I'm thinking, well, actually some good songs on there. You know, songs like, you know, it's more guitar orientated. They'd moved from their sort of 80s phase into the early 90s, and then they were much more hard rocking at this point, and there was a lot more guitar back into the mix. But again, the songs weren't as good, and certainly the album that preceded it, Counterparts, was a much superior album. So Roll the Bones, I mean, it, again, for me, it was my introduction to Rush. A strange, you know, entry point, I think, for any sort of Rush fan. But that was the first actual Rush album that I bought on CD. So now we're heading into number 12, and we're going back to the 70s. And number 12, I'm rating Hemispheres. So this is a real full-on prog, and it's probably, you know, it's a good album, but I think I'm rating it down a little bit because there's only 4 songs on it, and one of them was an instrumental. You know, it's, you're not getting much value for money, but this is really them in their most progressive, their most progressive album, I think. You know, but for me, it's not. There's a lot more better albums. I'm putting this in 12th position. In 11th position is Roll the Bones. Now, I like Roll the Bones. I mean, you know, they're still sort of struggling to sort of shake off that sort of 80s sound, even though we're sort of getting into, you know, we've got a bit more guitar. There's some good songs on here. I mean, I think Geddy's vocals sound really, really good. You know, it's a real sort of good, his vocals are getting to the point where he's wailing a lot less, and they're just really nice and sound good. And the solos on this are really good as well. Alec Lifeson has done some real good clean solos on this, so you get the good balance there. But you know, it only makes number 11. Now we're heading to the top 10. In 10th position, we have the album Snakes and Arrows. Now, this is their sort of penultimate album, and I think Far Cry, which is the first song, is probably one of the best Rush openers. I mean, it's got a really great modern sound and some really great acoustic guitar in this. You know, it's not something that you associate much with Rush, but I find that this album's got some really good acoustic playing on there. And you know, I think it's a really good album, Snakes and Arrows. And you could see this is when they were starting to hit their stride back again, and they were, you know, this was them back to their sort of best, really. So 10th, Snakes and Arrows. And then in 9th place, again, early 80s album, Signals. Now, this was the album when it went really heavy on synths. You know, the guitar is very sort of lost. It's almost like non-existent. I mean, there's a few solos in there, but you know, I think, you know, we need more Alex Lifeson in this. You know, there's a 3-piece, but suddenly it became very sort of keyboard orientated. And so, you know, you've got songs like, you know, Subdivisions, which is a great live favourite. It's probably one of my favourite Rush, it's probably my top 5 Rush songs. It's a really great song. The rest of the album's not so good, but I think, you know, I'm rating it down because I think, you know, there's not enough guitar in this, and you know, you've got to have more guitar in any rock album. Then we go to number 8, and we're going back into the 70s to Farewell to Kings. Now I think this is a good mix of prog sort of epics and also one of the most accessible songs, Close as the Heart. It's a really good album, this, and the songs that are epics are not overblown or overbloated. I think they're really good songwriting. So Farewell to Kings in number 8 position. Then in 7th position, their latest, well, I mean, it's been a few years obviously, but their last album was Clockwork Angels. This was the album that I saw them on a subsequent tour. It's a great album. It's a real hard-hitting rock, quite heavy metal, and a lot more progression. But it really takes the sort of album preceded Snakes and Arrows and takes it to the next step. You know, it would have been good to see where they'd gone, where they would have gone from there, because it was probably one of their best albums of the last sort of 20 years. It's that good. In 6th place, now we're getting serious. Permanent Waves. Now this is the song, this is the album with the song Spirit of the Radio on it. You know, it's a real sort of breakthrough in terms of their sort of commercial, their commercial albums, a real breakthrough album. It's a really good album. I mean, Free Will again is another real classic Rush song. And you know, I think, you know, a lot of people would put this a bit high, but I'm putting it in 6th position. In 5th position, this is probably one of my favourites of the sort of more progressive eras, and that's 2112. It's a great concept album. That first track, like almost the first side of the album, is absolutely, it's like a sort of suite of songs. It's absolutely superb. It's probably their best prog epic, I think, and the whole album is just really good. I mean, this was an album that they literally threw caution to the wind, because they were getting very close to getting dropped from their record label, and they realised that they had to come up with the goods, so they could either go more into a more commercial sort of move more into commercial songs, or they could go the other way and just produce something that was a big overblown concept album. And that's what they did, and you know, the fans loved it. It sold really well, and it pretty much saved Rush from pretty much, you know, finishing at that point. To 2112, great album, classic songs on it, superb prog rock. You know, it's up there with the sort of, you know, the top prog rock concept albums ever. In 4th position, Counterparts. Now this is an album that you know, they were in the 80s, the late 80s, they were struggling a bit, and then, you know, obviously at the beginning of the 90s the music scene was changing, you know, grunge was starting to come in and stuff like that. But Counterparts, it was just a real breath of fresh air. I think a lot of it's down to the production of the album. The songs are really good. It's again much more guitar orientated than the sort of 80s keyboards and synths orientated. But this is where the songs really sort of came into their own. I mean, songs like Animate is just brilliant. Nobody's Hero. I mean, they're brilliant songs. I love that album. Number 4 is Counterparts. In 3rd position, and I think a lot of fans would probably put this in top position, is Moving Pictures. Now this is the sort of classic album with all the great tracks that everyone knows. So you've got Tom Sawyer, you've got Red Barchetta, you've got Limelight. They're really great songs, and I think Rush at this point took a step up into the sort of big leagues. You know, with this album, it was you know, had a still was progressive, but it had much more sort of shorter, harder hitting songs that, you know, that were really sort of accepted by a lot of fans that probably didn't really like their sort of progressive 70s progressive sort of sound. So Moving Pictures, I think a lot of people would put it as their first, but for me it's in 3rd position. Now this is where I think it controversial, because in 2nd position, you know, it's a great album, and you know, I talked about the Rush in the 80s and overusing synths, and you know, you could say that Power Windows, which we're saying as I'm saying is their 2nd best album. You know, it's got loads of synths on it. You listen to it and you think, God, that sounds like the 80s. But the thing is with this, I think the guitar playing is really good. Some of the solos are absolutely brilliant. But the thing is about this album is it's chock full of great tunes. You know, Geddy's singing brilliantly. They're all at the top of their games, but there is a sort of 80s sheen over it, you know, with a lot of production and a lot of, you know, little bells and whistles that you would get in the 80s. You could say it's a bit overly produced, but the songs are that good. I think they shine through. I love Marathon, I love Emotion Detector, Territories, Mystic Rhythms. You know, it's very 80s, but you know, what's wrong with that? That's what I'd say. Okay, so now we're heading for the #1 position, and my favourite album by Rush, and the one that I'm ranking as #1, which again, I don't think there'd be a load of people that would rank it as #1, but for me it means a lot. It means the most to me because I just think that I really resonate with the songs, and that is Grace Under Pressure. You know, again, this has a real fine balance between guitar and keys in this. You know, considering that the album Signals before that, you know, I think this one came out and it has, right, we're going to bring more guitar into it. It was, you know, the production wise it was much better, but again, the songs, it's a little bit dark in terms of the subject matter. The songs are really good. They really sort of, I think, take some of their best sort of songwriting from their sort of earlier 80 albums, like Moving Pictures and Permanent Waves, and this is where their songs to me just really sort of click. Again, you know, I mean, a lot of people may disagree and say, well, actually, I think there's better songs on Moving Pictures, but for me, as a whole album, I think it's just consistently good. I can't think of any songs on there that I don't like. Between the Wheels is probably my favourite Rush song of all time. Great solo, just a great song. So, Grace Under Pressure is my #1 Rush album. Interested to know what you think. You know, let me know in the comments what is your favourite Rush album. You know, maybe you want to say how you would rank the 19 albums. You know, what got you into Rush? I think Rush are one of those bands that sort of, you know, you either love them or you hate them. There's no sort of middle ground really. You know, it took me a while for them to click, but when they did click, I really sort of got them and really appreciate how great musicians and what great songwriters they are. So there's my ranking of the Rush albums. I hope you enjoyed it. Obviously we have a little break from the beer this week with this ranking album. We're going to be doing more ranking albums in December, and in fact we're going to have a music theme throughout December. We're going to do certain reviews, we're going to do some ranking, we're going to do some essential albums of that genre of the rock within the rock arena. So I'm not going to give away too much just yet. You have to wait for that in December. So until then, you know what you need to do. Keep on rocking.